Hello, RGL2100 students. Back to you for lesson 4 on theories on what shapes regulations. This is an important topic because it ties back to my earlier point in lesson 1 on the fact that regulation is always fundamentally political. But we have to understand that concept in greater context, and so we are returning to that point now. And it's important for you to understand also that this is a way of understanding how regulatory outcomes can occur. And you'll see two schools of thought that try to interpret or try to lay out a theoretical framework from which we can understand how regulatory outcomes take the shape that they take when we do produce regulations as regulators and within government. How did we get there? And one of the key things that you have to recognize is that when you're a regulator, when you're doing regulation, whether you're managing the regulations of a corporation, working for a corporation, or in government, the same thing occurs, although on different scales. It can be surprisingly difficult to figure out what the public interest is when you're grabbing a harm, when you're dealing with a harm, okay? It may seem very obvious that, oh, we're dealing with a harm, we're going to regulate away a harm, but at the same time, there would be other people sitting across the other side of the table and saying, whoa, hang on. When you address this harm, are you creating more harm? All right? What is really in the public interest begins to become less clear-cut and less specific when you have to live in the real world of regulation as political outcomes, okay? And it's important for us to understand that, and because as I've said before, science can certainly influence our knowledge and provides us knowledge of where we are sitting right now relative to the harm. But science cannot determine the outcomes, cannot determine our subjective choices about what level of harm we're willing to accept or what other priorities will take precedence over controlling or mitigating a harm, okay? And so that's why regulation, well, it needs to rely heavily on science to maintain as much objectivity in decision making as it can. But because all regulation redistributes wealth, it also becomes politico-economic, right? And their politics begins to take over. So when you're in the system and you're a regulator and you're looking at this, you start off with this clear notion that addressing the harm is in the public interest. I'm doing good. Okay, then you get into the process of negotiation with industry groups, NGOs, political masters, and so on, and the thing starts to get a little bit fuzzy, right? It starts to get a little, well, wait a second, yeah, you're right. If we do the harm reduction in this way, we could result in 1,000 workers being laid off, or it could result in inequitable outcomes for different groups in society, or it could end up with, there are any number of scenarios that can arise, all right, which makes it much less clear-cut. How do you track the public interest through the process? How do you know whether you're in acting in the public interest or not? Or how do you know whether you're actually just serving private interests in the process? Okay? And as a regulator, this is a constant struggle as you sort through trying to get a regulation on the books and approved by cabinet. Okay? So this is something to think about. And what this lesson does is it sets up two theoretical frameworks which are used as benchmarks, comparative benchmarks, ideal types, if you will, to see whether we can predict or we can better understand the outcomes of regulation as compared to something. Because all knowledge by its very nature is comparative, right? We take a benchmark or we take an ideal type and we kind of say, well, does that ideal type explain most of the real world outcome? And if it does, then we learn from that, right? We learn that the key factors in that theory had value. Or if the real outcome deviates from that theory, why did it deviate? So the theory is still valuable because now we're asking the why question or originating from it, right? So all learning is comparative, right? And so what theories do is they set up a framework of an ideal type that's comparative with real world outcomes, so we can determine where the outcomes are consistent with the theory and where they are inconsistent with the theory, and we learn in both cases, all right? So that's why we set up theories of regulation, all right? So let's get started on this key lesson here, okay? Theories on what shapes regulation, all right? So let's look at this, okay? But first I want to give you the concept of public goods. What are public goods, okay? All regulation by a government is a public good, all right? And there are various conditions in society that can put downward pressure on public goods. Economic hardship, the power of a regulated party or potentially regulated party, all kinds of things can put downward pressure on public goods, right? And the key challenge for a regulator is that when they're trying to address harms is to make sure that that downward pressure on public goods can be overcome. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But what is a public good, right? You know, a key challenge for regulators is to understand when and how they can advance regulations in a manner that advances a public good, also known as a public interest, okay? By reducing the factors that are or can contribute to harm in society. You know that, right? When we're addressing a harm through regulation, we are typically addressing the factors that create that harm. Remember, right? When we're regulating a harmful chemical product, we're trying to regulate its harm or its potential for harm while capturing the benefits of that product. So we're trying to regulate things like exposure, inappropriate exposure to the chemical, or inappropriate use of the chemical, or rather than necessarily the chemical itself. Except in those cases where we have a product that is so hazardous, so dangerous that there's no way to manage it effectively and capture its benefits, and then we would ban it. And that would be banned based on hazards. But when we regulate the typical way, we're regulating based on risk. We're trying to capture the benefits of the product while controlling its risk, right? Don't forget that, all right? So public goods try to do that, right? But whenever you try to regulate, of course, you're redistributing income. You're saying to the industry, if you're going to sell this product, fine, but you're going to sell it under strict conditions and under strict controls. And those strict restrictions on the industry are things that cost money. And that money that's costing the industry is redistributing benefits to the people who would have the harm controlled on their behalf, the average citizen or the person taking a pharmaceutical or the people that eat food that are grown with the use of pesticides and so on, right? So whenever you redistribute, you're redistributing from a private interest to a public good, all right? And so that's why regulation is always fundamentally political. Somebody pays and somebody benefits, all right? The definition of politics, essentially, all right? Okay, so what are public goods? Public goods can be defined as a commodity or service that is provided without profit to all members of a society, either by the government or a private individual or organization. Non-profit NGOs provide all kinds of public goods, right, for no profit, right? So it's not just government, right? But generally speaking, governments are in the business of providing public goods because that's what they are. They're the government of the public, right? So environmental, public health, and food safety regulations, all the things we're concerned about in our program, are prominent examples of public goods in the area of regulation, all right? And so based on what I just said, they are fundamentally political as a result, right? But what defines public goods? We need to understand what defines public goods, okay? Public goods are defined by the characteristics that are important for all regulators to understand, right? In fact, all public service providers need to understand it. Firstly, what is the characteristic of a public good? Firstly, when a public good is supplied, it is impossible to exclude other individuals from deriving a benefit. The market principle of supply and demand does not apply, all right? So that's typical of regulation. If the government adopts a regulation, right, if I'm protected from, by the regulation, so are you. Right? You may not be if you have no relationship whatsoever with the product, then you're not protected. But if you did have a relationship with the product, you would be freely protected just like everybody else, right? So it is supplied by the government, and it's available to everybody. Okay. Secondly, when a pure public good is consumed by one individual, the stock available for others does not diminish as it would in the case of a private market good. Okay. So again, the government provides that service, but somebody's paying, right? Somebody's paying for this, right? The benefit is a public good, right? The regulation is a public good. Who's paying for it is a private good. All right. Okay. Thirdly, consumers, i.e. citizens, cannot reject a pure public good and are forced to consume it. Okay? For example, an individual cannot reject being defended by police services or the armed forces. As such, once again, market forces do not apply. All right? This, and the stock of public goods does not diminish, is not exclusionary, and cannot be rejected. For those reasons, private entities clearly will not provide public goods, right? And that's why regulation is essential. Why wouldn't private entities provide public goods? Because with the three characteristics of public goods, they cannot profit from it, right? They can't profit from it. It cannot be denied to an individual, then it's not a market good. I can't price it and make them pay for it, right? If it's undiminished, I can't benefit from supply and demand. If my product's under high demand, I can't raise the price to capitalize on. The industry's not going to be interested in that, right? And public goods can't be rejected. Well, the whole principle of the private free market is, if you want it, you pay for it. If you don't want it, I'll find another customer. All right? So public goods and regulation is a public good, okay? And that says a lot about and those public goods are paid for by private interests that get regulated, right? How are they paid for? Well, they don't actually strictly pay for it, but they have to pay to comply with it, right? And that's a cost to one party and a benefit to another party, all right? Which makes it always fundamentally political. And public goods can only be provided by government because of the characteristics of public goods. And so you have government essentially compelling private interest to provide a public good benefit. Okay? You understand the political dynamic that then comes into play. All right? Public goods must be provided by government in the collective interest, including regulatory protections. Okay? Now, this dynamic I'm explaining, I mean, how what are our theories about how this plays out? Okay? And there's two dominant theories. There's simple theories, but there's two dominant theories, and they can be very useful in thinking through, how a regulatory outcome occurs. Okay, let's look at this. The public interest school and the private interest school. They are important because they give us ways to conceptualize the provision or lack thereof of public goods in the form of regulations. Okay, so these schools look at, why are we getting public goods and why are we not getting public goods? All right, and they develop two theoretical frameworks to try to give us a benchmark to compare with, right? So that way we can, as I said earlier, we can determine, that was consistent with the theory, or that wasn't consistent with the theory, but now we have a question we can explore as to why not. And that's why theories are valuable, right? Like Weber's ideal type of a bureaucracy, right? He set up an ideal type of a bureaucracy, and he said this generally reflects all bureaucracies. And then when we see deviation from that, we can say, well, why did it deviate? Let's explain that. Let's investigate that, right? And that's what theories do, all right? All theories are conceptualized in the abstract as an ideal type that can be used to compare real-world events with a logical framework of understanding. And that's the definition of all learning, all right? We set up our understanding of the way things should be, and if they deviate, we kind of go, why did it deviate? And that's the question that leads to inquiry, to new knowledge, new understanding. All right. So they help us understand observed regularities. Okay. They predict probability of future events and relationships. Serve as a basis to clarify and categorize new observations. That's what theories do. If you understand theory, if you were to take an MA in empirical theory, the way I did when I was coming up through college, you get into a lot and you learn a lot about the way the human mind functions and the way it works. As we always, even if we don't realize it, we're always comparing things to an abstract ideal. All right? When we're unhappy with somebody, it's because we had some ideal in our head the way they were supposed to behave, right? And so on, okay? So let's look at the public interest or normative school, which theorizes that regulators reveal a strong desire to promote the public interest and have sufficient skill, information, and powers to do so. Remember, right? This is all about pursuing the public interest or a public good on behalf of the public interest. Okay, so they're trying to explain this, and what they're explaining is the reason we get regulation, despite its political dynamics, despite the pressure it creates for taking from a private interest to provide a public good. We do it because our governments are altruistically motivated. They have the skill, the information, and the powers to do so in the broad public interest. Okay, so they argue that most regulation indicates this. Okay, otherwise, why would we do it? Why would we go up against these powerful private interests if that was not the case? Would be their argument. Okay. Regulators are perceived as largely benevolent actors, aiming to pursue the public interest as their primary goal, albeit secondary goals emerge in regulatory negotiations to win support of key stakeholders. Remember, once you get into the regulatory process, you arrive with a clear notion of the harm reduction that's necessary and how you're going to do it, right? You're confident. And then you get into the mix of, whoa, wait a second here, this interest over there says that, and this interest over there says that, and so on. And you know what? They have some points. So, geez, now what, right? And now we've got to start to negotiate, compromise, figure out the best way forward, the most efficient way to regulate the problem. You know, not going too far and driving thousands of workers out of work. Not do, you know, all of a sudden the whole equation becomes, well, more political, right? So, but the assumption behind this theory is that regulators have the possibility of advancing the public interest relative to regulated private interests that do not have a stake in public goods, as I just explained, right? So how does this occur? The public interest school says, well, it occurs because fundamentally in democracies serve the people, and regulators have a motivated interest to serve the public and the public interest to provide public goods that they need. All right? That's their theory, okay? But as I said, how do regulators know if they're still on target with the public interest through the lengthy process of developing regulation with myriad constituencies involved? Industry NGOs, precedent, the government, environmental or public health NGOs, the government, the media, other political parties in parliament. The thing starts to get really fuzzy. All right, at that point. So how do we know if we're still pursuing the public interest? That can be one of the most surprising things for a young regulator when they go into government. They think they have a mission. They think they know exactly the harm that needs to be reduced and so on. Then you get into the process and it's like, whoa, this is a lot more complicated than I realized, because, you know, you're right. If we do it this way, I mean, we could end up putting 1,000 young families out of work. I mean, whoa, wait, this, you know, okay, maybe we need to think about this, you know, and then through all of that, it's tough to hang on to what is the public interest and the public good here. Let's not compromise it too much, right? I mean, we may have to give a little bit on the edges, but fundamentally the environmental objective must reign supreme, right? Because we're controlling a harm in the public interest, and it's a public good that the public needs. All right, but it does get gets fuzzy. And the private interest school points that out, right? They come and they say, I think you guys are being a little bit naive here, right? But if you look at many regulations, it's hard to explain their existence outside the public interest school. Like, if we only bought into the private interest school, why do we have a lot of the regulations on pharmaceuticals? Why do we have a lot of the regulations on environmental contaminants, you know? Like, why do we have the regulations on medical devices if it was not the public interest school explaining it? And so certainly the public interest school explains a lot of it, but it can't explain all of it, right? And the private interest school comes in and says, hey, I have a better explanation. Later on, I'll talk to you about the merging of those two, okay? But from the public interest school perspective, the following types of arguments are used to argue that the public interest has been advanced by a regulatory process despite the politics. Okay? 1, fair, inclusive, and transparent public consultation processes and decision-making procedures have been used. Remember about that concept, all right? Because remember what I told you before. The people's confidence in the expertise, the skill, and the process of the system ensures high levels of voluntary compliance. Therefore, high levels of public legitimacy are required, right? And that's one way the public interests get advanced, right? By fair, inclusive, and transparent public consultation processes. Okay, a reasonably significant majority of the population thinks that action on an issue is warranted. For example, coming out of an election platform. Okay, the Liberals win their first mandate. They said in their campaign they were going to regulate carbon emissions. They were going to bring in a carbon tax with associated regulations. They did that. There was still dispute, right? Still dispute, but the public generally would look at that and say, well, they said they were going to do it. We can continue to dispute it, but they said they were going to do it. Right? So while there's grumbling, there's not marches in the street, right? So something about the public interest was there, okay? A set of pragmatic interests we all have in common, such as clean air, water, defense, security, public safety, and a strong economy is driving the process. Generally, when there's predominant paradigms, predominant norms in society that support a regulation, we're really negotiating around the edges, but the public legitimacy, the public interest of the regulation is generally not disputed. Very few people would dispute that we need fresh water, right? And that needs to be regulated. Very few people would dispute that we need to regulate public safety. Very few people would dispute that we need a national defense, okay, etc., right? So these are not areas that can be, assailed very effectively by private interests, right? A common knowledge about a shared set of values or normative principles widely held by the public is in place, right? Like protection of children, preventing child brides, treating certain groups differently than the others before the law. All of these things. I'm not saying none of those things happen. They do. But generally speaking, there's not much pushback on that. It's seen to be in the public interest, obviously, right? So these are indicators where the public interest continues to be advanced, because we need indicators like that, because you can't point at a single outcome and say that was in the public interest, because you might have been able to do it 10 other different ways. Well, why do we end up doing it this way? Well, we probably end up doing it this way because that was the consensus that we could build among the population to advance this public good, okay? Now the private interest school comes along and it says quite a bit different, right? It says that the public interest theory reflects, is naive. It doesn't. Their theory reflects what actually is, rather than an idealized supposition of the public interest school. Okay, in many ways, this school is essentially an application of economic rationality to public decisions. They use the same models in economic rationality, but apply it to public decisions. So it can be seen as more of a real world portrayal or a more pessimistic portrayal. Remember, that there's a fine line between the two, right? These theorists posit that regulators cannot possibly have sufficient information about the public's understanding and operations of regulated entities to be able to advance the public interest effectively. They say you guys are living in a dream world. Industry will tell you what they want to tell you. It's that simple, and they're going to push back, and they have lots of power. They're going to win out a lot of the times. Okay? So while the public interest school can point to all kinds of regulation, well, why are they there if they're not in the public interest? The private interest school would point at those regulations and say, yeah, okay, they're there. But are they there as a smokescreen? Do they actually protect industry? All right? Do they go as far as they need to really protect the public from harm? Okay? And if not, why not? Well, I'll tell you why not. Private interests are winning out in the regulatory process is the argument that they would use. Okay? They argue that private interests have significant power advantages over regulators. Expert industry knowledge, investment decisions, employment decisions, trade influence, etc. Right? Government can only go so far as regulation, and the industry says, okay, we're picking up stakes, we're moving to Mexico or the United States or to Great Britain or wherever, right? That's, so they argue that, you can't possibly really promote the public interest in the context of that disequilibrium of power, all right? So, and they also argue that, it's very difficult to separate sometimes the regulator from private interests, because there are conflict of interest among individuals who run the regulator, and may also lead to regulatory capture because, maybe they go from the industry to government, government to industry. Maybe they begin to know each other too much, and we begin to see regulatory capture, okay? You've heard that concept of regulatory capture, where the regulatory organization begins to identify too much with with a regulated party, and they begin to merge in terms of their common interests, okay? Which can be human nature, right? If you're regulating the same party over 10 years, yeah, hey Bob, how's the kids? You know, yeah. Oh, how was your time at the cottage? I mean, how? Yeah, you know, like you begin to become, you know, and there's different ways regulatory capture can occur at the institutional level, in the design of the regulatory organization. Let me give you an example of that. You know, the CRTC in Canada has two mandates, right? To regulate the telecommunications industry on the behalf of the public, and to assure the economic viability of the radio and telecommunications industry in Canada. How do you do both, right? And they would argue that the CRTC has been subject to regulatory capture for a long time, and that was a battle that went over the last 10 years to make sure that one side of the CRTC's mandate was not dominating the other. But we can see many examples of this. Okay, the banking sector in Finance Canada, for example, all right, can be a classic example of that, right? And the point that the private interest school is making is that only highly motivated stakeholders, you know, can be understood only by pursuing their own interests. And that matters to them. Primarily economic issues matter to them. And the public interest is something that they have to maybe compromise with, but, you know, they have lots of power, and their interest is primarily their private interest, okay? Which is hard to dispute also, right? Well, we can't dispute all of what the public interest school says. It's pretty hard to dispute all of what the private interest school says too, because we've seen it both at work, right? We've seen them both at work. So the question then becomes, what best describes the public interest school or the private interest school, the outcome in this particular regulatory outcome? How can we explain that regulatory outcome by using these two frameworks and say, public interest school is a better predictor of this part, but maybe the private interest school is a better predictor of this part, okay? So that's why we use these two frameworks, because they give us a benchmark, a place to start. Because the public interest school would have predicted this kind of regulatory outcome. The private interest school would have predicted this kind of regulatory outcome. What did we get? Oh, we got a blend. What happened? Okay. But the private interest school keeps saying that regulations end up being developed to protect powerful private interests against competition, or modified to not harm these interests. We see that all the time in pharmaceuticals, for example, right? A lot of the regulatory requirements, labeling requirements, and other types of requirements can easily be handled by the large multinationals. Less so by the upstart small and medium-sized pharmaceutical companies. So the large companies say, we have no problem with this system. This system works for us. It's great. Because they know that simultaneously the public has confidence in their product, but the government is creating a high bar for new entry. Okay? So there's always half a dozen of one and six of the other, right? And we have to understand that as regulators, okay? So the private interest school says that, you know, given the assumptions that we have, there's no reason to conclude that regulations will promote public goods in the public interest, and each must be assessed on its own merits. And it's hard to disagree with this, right? It's hard to disagree with it. Okay? Public interest school would come back and say, well, how do you explain environmental regulations then? Clearly those are in the public interest, because private interest just has to pay to clean up their act and all the public benefits, right? And the private interest school guys come along and say, yeah, okay, why aren't environmental regulations working? Because if we really, really wanted to control environmental damage, we could do it. We could do it. We have the technology. For example, we could have EVs. We could have a mandate that said EVs by tomorrow morning. No problem. We have the tech. Okay? But they're saying that, you know, that will never happen because the private interest school better predicts the outcomes of even environmental regulations, right? Those regulations will be softer than they need to be because private interests have won out. Those regulations will be in some areas and not in other areas because private interests have won out, right? But that, again, on the other side is too simplistic an explanation because you still haven't explained why the environmental regulation at all, okay? So you can see that there are two things going on here, right? There's some of the public interest is true, some of the private interest is true. We set up two theoretical frameworks to be able to assess what came out, okay? Did the public interest have the primary influence on the regulation, or did the private interest? And we need to explain that, all right? Now, I said that the economic rationale is applied to public policy decisions in the private interest school, and that's what's called the public choice model. Okay, and it's important for you to understand the public choice model because it's based on how people make decisions in the regulatory process. It says, why are certain decisions made the way they are? Why do certain people in the parties in the regulatory process have more power than others? Okay. But the public choice framework says that commercial interests will always seek to further their own self-interest in regulatory processes, and that their more focused financial incentive will always win out. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm going to regulate, let's say, the auto manufacturers, okay, as a general person of the public, yeah, I'm interested in having cleaner air. I'm interested in having cleaner cars. I'm interested in having safer cars for my kids and all of that. So I'm supporting that regulation. I may even join a safety NGO for this purpose. I may give them $50 a year as a donation, okay? But that's it, right? Because the benefit that I get is not so different from the benefit my neighbor gets who gives them no money, all right? So my tolerance for transaction costs to support this pressure for regulations is going to be pretty low because my discrete individual benefits are also going to be low relative to all of my neighbors who are free riders and don't give to the NGO. So my incentive is to help a bit, not too much, right? Because I'm making that cost benefit calculation in my head the way we always do. We go in the store to buy a pair of shoes. If I buy these shoes, man, they'll be nice, but I won't be able to afford a rent. All right? So these are the kinds of things that are always going through the human mind, right? All the time, right? In addition to comparison, right, with ideal types, we're also constantly doing a cost-benefit analysis in our own heads all the time, right? We may not even be conscious of it, but we're doing it all the time, all right? But take the private interest guys now, right? If they can influence downward pressure on the public good in regulating their industry, they can save tens and hundreds of millions maybe. So their tolerance for transaction costs is huge. They're willing to give millions to fight the regulation because they'll save hundreds of millions if they're successful at fighting the regulation. So private interest school says there's no way. There's no way, the private interest is always going to be more motivated, more financially adept, more financially capable to oppose the regulation, right? And they have a point in many areas. Greenhouse gases, the oil and gas sector, all of these things, right? There are many examples where the private interest school has it right? But why is the regulation there at all? So you can't dismiss the public interest school. There's certainly a lot of truth to that too. So there's a bit of everything, right? Now, the key concept here is transaction costs and benefits, right? All regulatory efforts have transaction costs. If you're lobbying for a regulation, you have transaction costs. If I'm in the industry and I'm trying to influence the regulation because it could save me hundreds of millions, I have a high tolerance for the transaction costs. I'm going to fund my industry group big time if this thing's going to save me 100 million bucks. All right. If I'm sitting there as I'm a member of an NGO and I'm promoting, I'm willing to go, okay, maybe I can go from 50 to 100 bucks, but Bob up the street is going to benefit as much as I am, and he's not giving you anything. So we have a free rider problem, right? And that creates a disincentive. All right. And plus, people lobbying for public goods tend to be, highly diffuse, right? Highly disparate. Like, for example, if we're trying to bring in a new regulation to protect the environment, there may be people from BC and people from Newfoundland all supporting it. They have completely different lives. They don't know each other. They will each enjoy a benefit that's equal to so much, but not too much, because my neighbor is going to benefit just as much as me, and he's not giving them anything. And and plus the transaction costs of raising money from all this disparate people. It costs a lot of money. Some NGOs must spend 50% of what they earn just to earn more, right? Whereas the industry, all it has to do is open up its checkbook, and if you guys are going to save me $100 million on curtailing this regulation or turning it back, you got all the money you want. Go. Here's a blank check. As long as it doesn't exceed my benefits, we're good. All right? And so that creates a political dynamic in the regulatory process in and of itself, right? And it's true, right? We know that it's true. We all think this way, right? Why am I going to give extra money when Jane is not giving nothing, and if this is successful, Jane benefits as much as I do. But I'm a good person. I'm an altruistic person, so I am willing to give $100 because I really believe. But beyond $100, I mean, got to feed the kids, and yeah. Whereas the industry is saying, "Hey, here's $100 million if this is going to help me solve this problem." Okay. So, the economic interests that seek to avoid or shape regulation in their favor tend to be relatively few, homogeneous, and concentrated, right? Everybody who buys a car, millions. Everybody who produces a car, 6 or 7 big guys. It's easy for very low transaction costs and high incentive for them to get together and provide the lobby group that's supporting them with $100 million to fight the campaign. That's pocket change relative to the benefit I would get if the regulation is turned back. So you have these two forces that are in the regulatory process. One that's putting downward pressure on public goods, it's well-funded, it's so on. One that's putting upward pressure on public goods, but it's diffuse, has a free rider problem, hard to mobilize, right? What does this mean for regulators? Well, regulators are constantly, who are trying to promote the public good, are constantly in this battle. They're trying to make sure that the private interests don't completely outweigh things that are important to a regulatory process. That's why regulators will always defend the science, and regulators will always defend open transparency and engaging NGOs in the process. So good regulators always have connections with NGOs. We're having a public consultation meeting. You got to send somebody. Oh, you can't afford. Oh, we have a little bit of money for you to send somebody to the meeting, right? Because the regulator is trying to balance these power relationships in the process, okay? Because otherwise there will be too much pressure on public goods and the regulatory process will not be advanced. So, a key challenge for regulators seeking to advance the public interest is to inform and reduce the barriers, i.e. transaction costs, to mobilization of support for public goods. So that tells you right there that in the public interest school, if you're advancing the public interest, you're actually trying to influence what the private interest school says to be able to achieve that public good. So you can see both dynamics are always in play in a regulatory process, but we use the two theories to understand, oh, the public interest really won a lot in this one. The private interest will kicked our butts on this one. Look how weak that regulation is. It's a joke, And so that's how we understand how our regulatory outcomes came out of a regulatory process which is always fundamentally political. All right. And, and this all ties to regulatory legitimacy, right? All regulations compromise in some fashion between the public interest and private interest, right? This is simply the reality of a free market society where power is highly diffuse, as I explained in Lecture 1. Remember those concepts I brought up? Public legitimacy, power relationship, diffuse power in society. Remember I told you we would call them back into understanding what's going on with regulation? Well, this is what I'm talking about, right? Different components of society have power in their own. They're not just going to say, oh yeah, regulate us, whatever, man, yeah, we're good, no problem. Right? No, they have their own power sources. They have their own contacts in media. They have their own threats that I'll move my investment elsewhere. They have, right? And the public interest says, well, you know what? We'll tell the public you're saying this, or we'll go to an election, or we'll stir up the public to do more, and then you'll have riots in the streets. It's never stated so overtly, but there's always that background dynamic in every regulatory process that's of any significance, particularly medium and high impact regulations, which we'll learn about more as we go into the second term. Okay? So all regulators are challenged to maintain public legitimacy of regulatory institutions and processes, which means they can't just blow off the private interests, right? But they can give public interest everything they want, because then the private interests rebel and they do move their capital, they do whatever, right? They can't give the private interests everything we want, or else the public regulatory process becomes publicly delegitimized, and there's not high levels of voluntary consent, right? So regulation is always a balancing act between these two schools of thought. That's why it's important to think about these two schools of thought. Whenever you look at a regulatory income, I always look at that. For 30 years, I look at it and I kind of say, okay, I can guess how this played out. Just by when I read the regulation, I read its design, and I understand the sector that's being regulated, I can see how this played out. I can see where the industry exerted pressure here. I can see when the public interest was advanced here. I can basically tell you a lot of the story about a regulation by looking at the regulation, by understanding these two frameworks, and of course, many years of looking at regulatory practice and experience that I've had. But you develop an ability to interpret things fairly quickly. So, public legitimacy of that balance is a reality, and that's why the public interest school can sometimes lose focus, and you have to return to those criteria. Are we still on track here? Are we still achieving the objectives we set out to? Granted, there's been some compromise. Granted, we would like to be more forceful in the regulation, but we got like 70% of it, so that's not bad, right? We can live with that, right? The private interest school is saying, well, at least these government people didn't kill us off. I mean, we got some, we can live with that, right? So the public legitimacy of the system is maintained, and everybody goes along. Might be kicking cans and scoffing and a little bit ticked off, but okay, the process was fair, it was transparent, there was real science, there was real everything, so we can live with it, right? Move on. And so the high levels of voluntary compliance are maintained, all right? So that's why it's important to understand the two schools, okay? And so, practice at that, but also for your term papers. If you're looking at an existing regulation, like how cannabis was regulated, how pharma is currently regulated, gaps in pesticide regulation, or any things like that, you can adopt this as one of our approaches, right? You can take that regulation and say, how did we end up the way we ended up? Did the private sector really win here? Was the public interest maintained, or did the public interest only get a small percentage of the harm reduction originally sought, whereas because the private interest was too powerful here, or vice versa, right? Right? Because industry will gladly point out where they've lost, right? They've lost on oil and gas regulation, they've lost according to them, right? But again, that's all part of the politics too, right? But you as a regulator can't get wrapped up in that politics. You have to look at the harm reduction objective that was there and try to explain objectively and rationally where we ended up, or how we ended up where we are, right? And what explains how we ended up where we are, so that we learn for the next time. Okay? On that score, I'll let you go, and we'll be talking to you on the next lesson. All right? Take care. Bye-bye now.